Hey, Foresty Divers! Welcome! It is Thursday. It is August 27th, 2020, and you are on your Facebook Live with Foresty at the Boca Raton Facebook page. So hopefully you have successfully logged in and are watching us live right now. If you are, please give us a thumbs up, smiley face, or the heart emoji to let us know that you are enjoying this presentation tonight. You can also say hello to us in the comments section. Let us know where you're listening in from. We love to know where we're reaching, not just here in South Florida. We'd love to know if anybody else is watching us from other parts of the state, other parts of the country, or in the world. Maybe there's some people watching from, I don't know, Canada or the UK, who knows? So we love to see what people are doing. Hopefully you guys are staying safe, safe and healthy during this time. And during the August month is when we like to put together two different categories at Foresty. We like to put together the Goliath Grouper topic and photo equipment. And the reason why we do that is because here in South Florida, we are very, very, very lucky to get an aggregation of Goliath Grouper that hang out in the South Florida area. And we can go there during August through October to dive on some of these dive sites that they're hanging out and aggregating on. And it's like anywhere from 20 to sometimes 50 of these animals on one wreck. And it's just amazing to be able to see. And us as divers, we get to do this dive during those time periods. And so, of course, if you're doing these dives, why wouldn't you want to be recording and making those memories? So here at Foresty, if you go onto our website, www.force-e.com, you're going to notice that we have, for the month, we've got accessories for camera equipment. They're on sale. So you can go through those. And if you'd like to purchase anything, just use that code. I think it's, let's see, I'll find that for you guys real quick. And go ahead and shop online. You can also get these deals in the stores as well, because we are open. All three stores are still open. And we are having a great diving season. It's been, well, it was a little rough over the weekend because we had that hurricane that was maybe going to hit us, but it didn't. So now we've got flat calm seas today, starting today and through the weekend. So if you are looking to go diving, this is the time to go. Nice warm water, 85 to 86 degrees, and we've had great visibility. I did the wreck of the caster last Friday, and it was top to bottom viz, and there were about 12 groupers hanging out there. So there's probably some more now that the storm kind of ran through, so we're excited to go out there and see them. We're actually going to go out this weekend to go check it out. So if you are interested in doing the dives with the Goliath Groupers, well, guess what? We have some spots available this Saturday. 2 people canceled, so I have 2 spots available. So go on www.force-e.com, go to the event tab, and you can see that we have a dive in Palm Beach that's scheduled this Saturday. And then our next one that we have as a group dive is September 13th, and that's in Boynton Beach. And that one just opened up, so there's plenty of spots there if you'd like to jump on and go and do these dives with us. But we can take you anytime to see these guys. You don't have to do one of these event dives. You can just give us a call, and we'll get you booked on a boat and go out there and see these guys. And like I said, they're here until October, so pick those days and go out there and see them and get some diving or get some camera gear and go take pictures and videos. So if you want to do this dive and you want a chance to win a dive trip, make sure that you go to our Eventbrite for tonight's event. It's our Eventbrite link. And if you just, like I said, go to the event tab on our website, click on that tab, it takes you to Eventbrite, register. You got to register, because at the end of this presentation, I'm going to take the names from the Eventbrite and put them into a random name picker, and I'm going to raffle off a free dive trip to go dive with the Goliath Groupers. So you have to make sure that you're on that Eventbrite registration page and get your name in there to get in that random name picker. You have until 7 p.m. to register, guys. All right, so I see everyone saying hello. Thanks for signing in. We're super excited. Hope everyone's happy and healthy right now. Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart emoji, or a smiley face. Throughout this presentation, you are welcome to ask questions. Just type them right into that comment section and we will do our best to answer them. So I am going to turn the presentation over. This is a good friend and good diver here in South Florida and a FWC biologist, Mr. Derek Cox. Welcome.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. Thanks, Nicole, and thanks to everyone for joining. As she said, my name is Derek Cox. I'm with Florida Fish and Wildlife. I'm a biologist for them within the Division of Marine Fisheries Management. However, I previously worked for the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute doing some Goliath Grouper research and still coordinate with the team there in Tequesta. And so today I'm going to give kind of a brief update on things that we do at the lab in general. There's a lot of different research going on and kind of give you a little bit of an inside peek of what happens at FWC because it is a lot more than some people realize. And then we'll get into a little bit of biology and life history of these Goliath Grouper and then talk about some recent research that we've been doing and some updates for any of you that may have listened in last year when I did a similar talk here. Go ahead, next slide, Nicole. All right, so it's not important to read this. I just wanted to kind of give a quick outline of all the different areas that FWC covers. So it's going to be a little awkward because I don't have control of the presentation here, so I can't kind of put my mouse over different areas. But the main thing I'm trying to get across initially is that whenever I tell someone I work for FWC, they assume that I am law enforcement and that what I do is I go out and I give people tickets for not following the rules and regulations for fishing. And that is not true. Law enforcement is a big part of FWC's organization. However, if you look at this flow chart here, the left-hand column, that's kind of the law enforcement group, and all the rest is non-law enforcement. So we have Marine Fisheries Management, which is where I currently work, which does a lot of the rules and regulations, stakeholder outreach, things like that, education. We have a similar department with Freshwater Fisheries Management, Hunting and Game Management. A lot of people forget is also part of this. So we do fisheries, but we also do hunting and game. We have a large group, lots of different types of things going on called habitat and species conservation. And they're doing a lot of research, restoration projects, things with invasive species. And then that far right column there is Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. And this is the portion of FWC that's just devoted to research. Again, lots of different sections within there. And the Marine Fisheries Research Group is who I'm going to be highlighting today that I was working with previously and continue to kind of help along with the research that they're doing on Goliath groupers. Next slide.
Derek, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
All right, so within marine fisheries, there's also a lot of groups. There's one that's just devoted strictly to the keys, some that do our stock assessments, our stock enhancement, where we have fish farming essentially to get some of these juveniles out there to help boost the numbers. We have our fisheries independent monitoring and our fisheries dependent monitoring group. And then we have our marine fisheries biology group. So a lot of various research just on marine fish going on, and that marine fisheries biology group is the one that's spearheading some of this Goliath Grouper research. Next slide. Yeah, you can go again. So the Tequesta Field Lab is up in Tequesta, just north of Jupiter. This is one of the main field labs for FWC in Southeast Florida. They have about 20 to 25 employees, so still pretty small. This is just FWRI research here. Their main South Regional office is in West Palm. But a lot of the research takes place at the Tequesta lab there. It's real close to the water and a very good spot to be located in for a lot of this research going on. Next slide. With these 20 to 25 employees, we cover a lot of ground. I'm just going to quickly hit on a lot of the different research that they're involved in. So it's the sea turtle research. They're going out there, they're counting nests, They're working with municipalities to develop, light rules and regulations for which lights can be on and when. They're monitoring nests. They're doing releases and rescues, necropsies, things like that. Next slide. Our manatee group we have located there. They have that giant manatee rescue truck, so they're going out if there's a stranded manatee. They're helping to capture it and either rehabilitate it or release it. They also do things like manatee counts in the winter when a lot of them move inshore. They do education and training for law enforcement and for boaters, and then a lot of outreach as well. Next slide. We also have some avian research, so birds. We have our snail kite biologist is there working on snail kites, along with other things like Cape Sable seaside sparrows, and then other birds common to the area and some less common. Next slide. We have our fisheries dependent monitoring group. So this is the group that's going out and actually collecting data from a lot of the fishermen. So if you see FWC folks on the dock and they're not carrying a gun and having a badge, they're probably part of this fisheries dependent monitoring group. They're collecting data on what people are actually out there catching. Part of that data can include, just species and length and weight, but also things like sex and age, where they actually sometimes can get permission from the anglers to take these fish and pull out their otolith, which is their ear bone. In that top right photo there, you can see it's got little rings, and you can kind of count them under a microscope, just like a tree, and figure out how old the fish is. And then you can also figure out sex, take samples for mercury, and a lot of the different information we get from just volunteer anglers when they come back with their catch at the docks and marinas and all on the beach and things like that. Next slide. Our fisheries independent monitoring. So this is a little different. This is not what people are catching. This is what's out there, kind of more of a scientific, unbiased sampling, looking at all the fish, not just fish that people are bringing back with them. And so this is the group that if you are up a little further north, maybe you see out there with these giant nets. They have these big haul seines that they're pulling through the water. They're counting and measuring and identifying all the different species that they catch. They're doing water quality. They're doing habitat and all sorts of different information that they're gathering on what's there to get a long-term data set for how things are changing, regardless of whether people are catching these fish or not. Next slide. And then we have our fish biology group. And so this is the group that's doing more of the exploratory research, I guess. It's less just monitoring program and more looking at what do we not know, what do we need to know, and how can we figure it out. So they do a lot of life history, biology, looking at age structure of these different stocks, how the fish are using different habitats and their movement up and down the coast or from maybe inshore to offshore, how things like red tide and hurricanes and water flow affect these fish. And some of the big things that they've been doing recently are looking at snook. They did a really long study on snook, very popular game fish, looking at things like how they're spawning, how often, where, what their cold tolerance is there any, what is the mortality for catch and release? Cobia as well is a big one they're doing right now. They're looking at their migration up and down the coast and seeing where this stock boundary maybe starts and ends, as well as how far they're going, what's causing these movements, things like that. And then they've got new projects started looking at sheepshead and sea trout. This one's focused on how these freshwater influx from things like storms and lake releases and things like that are going to be affecting some of these inshore fish. Next slide. They also do things offshore. They do help with SEFCRE, the Southeast Florida Coral Reef Initiative. They do surveys for fish offshore along these natural reefs, counting how many species they see, how many there are, what size they are. This is a big effort that goes on from the Keys all the way up through about the St. Lucie area, and provides a lot of data on what's on these reefs besides, like I said earlier, what people are catching, what's actually down there, and is a kind of a more structured version of some of the reef surveys that maybe some of you have participated in. Next slide. We also have this rapid response efforts. So these are kind of, curveballs that get thrown our way. Sometimes we have a blue-green algae or red tide pops up, and we are kind of first on the scene there a lot of times with, our boats that are ready to go and being located along the water there, and so we can get out and take samples quickly to get those submitted to the labs to run analyses on. Things like if an anchor has dragged across the coral, sometimes we're the first ones that are able to get out there and help remove it or assess damage. Things like sharks and Goliath Grouper, if they wash up on shore, we can do necropsies. A lot of times we're just very able and ready to go out there and do some of these kind of spur of the moment projects. Things like an example is the puffer fish. There were some reports that the toxin was making people sick in Palm Beach County, and so we were able to quickly go out and grab some puffers and get those submitted to the lab over in St. Pete so they could test these samples and see if there's something going on that we need to maybe put out and alert folks to not be consuming these. Next slide. And so the project I'm going to talk to you today about is with Goliath Grouper. And so as you saw a minute ago, a lot of stuff going on in the lab, just a small part, but it is a very important and cool project that's taking, it's about a 7-year project. So it's a long-term project that hopefully will give us some really neat result, looking at kind of this habitat selection and these movement patterns of the juvenile Goliath Grouper when they're still inshore and in the river, and as they migrate offshore to the reefs where you guys, when you're out diving, can see and enjoy them. Next slide. So just a little bit of background. A lot of you are probably already pretty familiar, but in case you aren't, just a little history of Goliath Grouper population in South Florida. Back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people moving down here and realizing that there's this giant fish that's not really scared of people and it's pretty easy to catch. And so there's kind of this field day they had in the 50s and 60s, catching just tons and tons of Goliath Grouper in a pretty unsustainable way. Next slide. I think there's another thing on this slide, actually. There we go. And so just some kind of data from back then. You can see on the left graph here, we've got the y-axis is number of individuals, and then x is the length. And so the dark bars are from the 50s. You see a lot more individuals. And then just a decade later, those gray bars, much lower numbers of individuals being reported. And a similar trend with the size, the right graph there. There's the general decrease in the bigger fish being caught, the bigger Goliath Grouper from the 1920s to the 60s and 70s. And so a big decrease here in these Goliath Grouper, these great fish. And so we're seeing that there's an issue here. And so next slide. And so the U.S. closed the fishery in 1990. It was added as a species of concern with the Endangered Species Act in 1991 and listed by IUCN as a critically endangered in 1994. So basically all capture in Florida of Goliath Grouper, all harvest of Goliath Grouper ceased. And we did start to see maybe some good signs here of recovery. There weren't a lot of great studies, but some preliminary data from these 4 studies here that are in this figure show that after that 1990 closure, you start to see some increases in abundance of Goliath Grouper. Next slide. But where they're at now is still uncertain. There's a lot of data that we're missing, we don't have from this fish. And so whether they've rebounded some, a lot, or fully is hard to say. So they do appear to be recovering. You can see this figure here, the black bars are during spawning aggregation and the gray ones are outside of that. But you see the number cited is going up each year, which is good. We like to see, especially for species that are, have been closed down and we want to be recovering. However, a lot of information that we typically get on fish to assess the population comes from having an open fishery, comes from what people are catching and how many of them and what size they are. And a lot of information that we can get from folks fishing for these fish helps go into understanding what exactly is going on with the population. And with the fishery being closed, we don't have access to a lot of that data, so we have to look other places. There's actually a stock assessment done in 2016 that was rejected because we lack so much of this kind of vital information for getting a full understanding of what's going on. And if it wasn't enough that we're having this population that's relatively slow growing, has issues like loss of habitat, and if that wasn't enough, we also have natural mortality events that are kind of hammering on them as well. Things like red tide, things like cold events that can kill off these fish when they're inshore. So other things in addition to just fishing can affect this population as well. So we need a lot more information on their life history, ecology, just the general population, how many there are, and how related they are, and where they're going and why, which gets into this project that we've got going here. Next slide. So acoustic telemetry is a great way to look at movement of animals that are not able to be captured through GPS. So basically things that are underwater. You can use GPS for things like sea turtles and sharks and things that breach the surface long enough to make connection with the satellites, but things that stay on the bottom, like a lot of these bottom-dwelling fish like grouper, you can't utilize that technology. So we turn to acoustic telemetry. Now how this works is you have on the left photo there in the guy's hand is looks like a little battery. That is a transmitter. So that actually gets surgically implanted into the fish. So we go out and we catch a fish, bring it in, we slice them open, insert this little transmitter, stitch them back up, maybe take some measurements or samples depending on what the project has going on, and then we release that fish again alive with this transmitter in it. On that left photo, you'll see what looks like maybe like a giant old cell phone or a really big battery. That's actually the receiver. And so that receiver we place in strategic locations, and when the fish with the transmitter comes near that receiver, it emits a unique ping, and that ping actually says what fish it is and logs the time, and the receiver stores all that information. We go out and we collect the receiver later, and we can download it and see which fish were there and when. So it's a kind of a workaround for more traditional studies that use GPS that can't be utilized in this situation. So it's nice to know, one fish is near this receiver and when, but really for these studies to be effective, you have to have lots of receivers spread out all over so you can know where the fish is, hopefully at any given time. But I'll get into that a little bit later. Some of the situations, depending on your questions, make it difficult to have enough coverage for that. Along with these acoustic tags, we are a lot of times putting in just a traditional dart tag, which looks like a little spaghetti noodle coming out of their dorsal fin or dorsal region, and that has a phone number to call where you can say, hey, I caught this fish that you tagged, this is where I was, and this is maybe how big it was, and this is maybe what bait I was using, whatever information they can give us before they hopefully release it. In the case of Goliath Grouper, they have to release it, but other fish, that potentially they would be able to keep the fish and maybe send us back that transmitter if it's got one. Next slide. And just as just a picture here of, we have these bases in some areas and we have the receiver sticking up, and then the fish swim by. Like I said, they emit that unique ping and it logs that information. Then we go out and dive sometimes. Sometimes they're just located on channel markers or docks, things you don't necessarily have to dive on. But then other times they're on maybe wrecks or natural reef area, floating buoys. There's also, depending on what project you're doing, you can attach them to a lot of different areas. They've got a range of roughly 500 to 1,000 meters. And so a lot of that depends on the, how much extra noise is going on. So there's a lot of boat traffic, a lot of wave noise. But if the fish is within 500 to 1,000 meters for, a minute or two, usually you'll be able to get him logged on that receiver that he was present there. Next slide. And so we have, our little, what we call an array of receivers set up around, it's basically from Fort Pierce to West Palm or so, but focused around the St. Lucie River estuary and the inlet there. But Goliath Grouper and cobia and lots of other fish move obviously a much greater distance than what we can cover in our array. So this network of scientists got together about 10 or 11 years ago and decided that we're going to share all of our data. If I get your fish, I'll tell you. You get my fish, you tell me. That way we can track some of these larger movements. And they're called the Florida Atlantic Coast Telemetry, the FACT network. So at this point, there's over 40 partner organizations involved, and it goes all the way up from the Keys all the way up into outside of Florida into South Carolina, North Carolina, and has expanded even beyond this graphic to a lot of areas in the Gulf that are showing information with these researchers, all the way up the Atlantic coast. There's a lot of folks, a lot of scientists that are using this same technology and working together to be able to share information so that especially fish that have big migrations, like the black-tip sharks up the coast here, that they'll find up in New York or somewhere, that they can track these long migrations. So this slightly old information, but when I gave this presentation last year, we had over 900 receiver stations set up within the fact array and over 4,700 animals tagged, 83 different species. So I'm sure those numbers have increased at this point. But really working together allows us to get the greatest information and the best knowledge about the animals that we're studying and to answer more questions. Next slide. So back to Goliath Grouper here. Again, some stuff that you guys may know, but if you don't, I'm just gonna go through a little bit of their life history. At first, they settle as larvae in these mangrove litter and propagules, shallow water up inshore, in estuaries, upriver maybe, where these mangroves are growing, and they're gonna feed on small stuff there and use these mangroves as shelter from predators. As they get a little older, they'll move out into some deeper mangroves. A lot of times now we're seeing them on docks and bridges and other artificial man-made structure within the intercoastal. As they get older, they will make a shift offshore and they will move on to these reefs, ledges, where eventually as they become sexually mature, they will aggregate to spawn. This is when a lot of you guys go out there to see them because it's awesome. You can see 10, 20, 40, 60 Goliath grouper all in one area, and there's these massive fish, and they're going to just batch spawn out there. Those eggs will be carried in by wind and currents back inshore, and the process starts again. Nicole, you may have to click through a few times here because, sorry. To go ahead and do 2 more. There you go. So first photo here is just a little juvenile that was probably caught in one of our seine nets, or maybe just home with a little dip net. Then you can see the second photo, you've got those mangrove papules dipping down in the water, and that provides a lot of structure and habitat for them to grow up, move offshore as they get bigger. You can see a little bit of size reference there with that diver if you haven't actually seen one in person. And then when they are mature adults, they form these spawning aggregations where they all get together. These fish can get 6 to 8 feet long, 600, 800 pounds, and are generally not scared of anything. And so a lot of times they'll let you get really close, and they'll, potentially you'll see the same one over and over again, either on the same spot or year after year if he's got some distinguishing feature that you can make out that is the same one. Next slide. Go ahead, and you'll probably have to click through a couple times here. So we've got all these big fish out there. You get great opportunities for photos when you're diving. I think you just kind of keep clicking through this. Sorry, everyone. Would have been a little easier if I had control, but we had some technical issues. And so just massive fish, really great opportunities to get up close to them and kind of enjoy them in their natural environment. Next slide. And so one of the gaps in knowledge we had was about this transition from juvenile to adult stages. When they make that shift from inshore to offshore, we don't know a lot of information about what causes that. Is there anything that triggers it? Is it just an age thing or a size thing? Is it a certain time of year they do it? Anything like that? And so this project, because of these tags can last up to 7 years, we're actually able to put tags in some of these smaller juvenile fish, and the tags, assuming the fish lives and the tags stay in and everything, we should get that entire transition from inshore to offshore, and maybe even a couple years of spawning aggregation behavior. We'll see, but the objectives were to look at that shift from this inshore mangrove habitat to offshore using these tags and the network that we had set up already from previous studies of these receivers, but also utilizing that fact array for any further movement up or down the coast. And we had some additional receivers we put out in strategic locations to hopefully catch some of this movement. So we were targeting these juveniles, as 1.5 to 3 feet in length to put these tags in. And then we're going to be looking at the difference between fish that are tagged in the river versus in the ICW or the Indian River Lagoon. And then also we have a sister study going on by FWC on the west coast of Florida in the 10,000 Islands area, doing the same thing, looking at, tagging these Goliath grouper when they're juvenile and seeing if they behave similarly to the ones on the East Coast here, if they have the same, triggers that are causing this movement or correlating with this movement, or if it's something completely different, or maybe they're going offshore and coming all the way around over here. We're hoping to see similarities and differences between the two coasts with this species. And then another part of this project is going to be looking at genetic diversity. So with a simple fin clip from these fish, we can look at their DNA and see things like get estimates of population abundance potentially, how diverse are they, a lot of different information we can get from just a little bit of DNA from these fish. So we're trying to get lots and lots of samples, because for it really to have any meaning and to be accurate, we need as many samples as possible. So we've been working with commercial trappers, fishing guys, recreational anglers, the fish that we've been catching out there, and getting as many samples for our genetics lab to run some of these analyses to get a better idea of the population overall, in addition to some individual movements that we're looking at with the acoustic portion. Next slide. All right, I think you may have to click a couple times here as well, Nicole. All right, so you can get that stop there, that's fine. All right, so on the left you have a map. This is the St. Lucie River, and kind of on the bottom right of that picture there is the St. Lucie Inlet, and to the right of that would just be offshore. And these green dots represent where we have these receivers located. So you can see a lot of them are on either narrow passes or on bridges. That's so that the fish can, hopefully, if it's swimming by there, it kind of is funneled in close to that receiver and we can get a detection. And then we have several around the inlet as well. So if it does go offshore, hopefully at least one of those picks it up on its way offshore. And we have receivers besides this, but this kind of gives you a good look at where we were focusing the study around the St. Lucie estuary there. You see the start as well, kind of those on the right side, you have those 4 right in a row going offshore. That's the start of what we call a gate. So that goes basically from west to east and makes a line with no gaps in between, where you don't have any detections or don't have any reception for these receivers. And so hopefully any fish swimming north or south that goes through that line there would get captured. So a lot of fish like a more pelagic fish like cobia that are going to be swimming maybe straight north quickly, hopefully will get caught by that gate there. And so we started off fishing a lot of mangrove habitat, because that's where traditionally these Goliath grouper are thought to be when they're juveniles, but we weren't really having a lot of success. A lot of mangrove habitat is not around anymore. And so we tried it, but a lot of the mangrove habitat is really shallow, and we weren't getting the success and the size of Goliath grouper that we were hoping for. So we started fishing more docks and bridges, and actually found that we had much greater success catching these kind of 1.5 to 3 foot Goliath groupers on this man-made structure. And so it's kind of interesting. We're seeing maybe a shift as mangroves disappeared. Maybe they're starting to, or forced to be using other objects as habitat. And if you look at this top right photo, this is a bridge piling cap. And there's the big cap there that provides kind of a shadow underwater. And you can just see the tops of these pillars that go down, almost mimicking mangrove propagules, obviously much larger, but kind of a similar setup. And we would catch, maybe 3 to 5 different Goliath groupers on one single piling cap sometimes. So they're definitely utilizing these almost like condominiums, where they're just hanging out, because it's what seems to be maybe perfect environment for them when they are inshore. Protection, but also having a lot of water flow through and prey potentially swimming by, but protection from predators within those pilings. So we went out, just a lot of rod and reel fishing for the most part. You can probably kind of slowly advance, Nicole, and I'll describe each picture here. I think there's going to be a few of them. So we just go up on these pilings and we fish, and hopefully if we hooked up with a grouper, we could get it out of there before it wedged itself in. Go ahead. And we get, this is kind of a smaller end of what we catch, but we'd start catching these Goliath grouper, and then we would start to weigh them and take our samples. This was actually from on top of the dock that we were able to get one. So this is about the larger size that we would do there on the top left. That's our crew from the Tequesta lab, each of us holding the fish, and they got a tag. We also utilized some trappers. They had traps that they'd throw out for crab, and a lot of times grouper would get caught in them, and so we would provide these trappers with little kits where they could just take a quick clip of the fin and put it in its vial. They have to be put on a special activities license because you can't just go cutting up Goliath Grouper, but we would get them added onto this license so they could help us take samples as they're tossing these Goliaths out of their traps. This is a chevron trap, so this is the trap that we actually put out. And so we would put this out and bait it, and had, limited success. Some areas we did really well. I think this photo, actually, we have 3 Goliath Grouper in there. But a lot of times we would put it out and get nothing, even though the Goliath Grouper we would see them, we'd snorkel or something, we'd see them all over, but they wouldn't bite any bait and they wouldn't get in the trap. So we used a variety of techniques to capture them so we could get these tags in, obviously keeping them alive so that they would take the tag and swim around with it. Here's a photo of us doing the tagging. A lot of times we kept them submerged in water so they could keep breathing. The whole process only takes a minute or two, so really it's not necessary, but trying to keep them calm so that it makes it easier on us if they're not thrashing about. Although Goliath Grouper tend to, once you get them out of their habitat when you're fishing, once you get them out of their hole, they kind of give up. And so a lot of times they were pretty cooperative. We have a weighing or a measuring station there, kind of a little trough that we put them in to take their weight. Get that. You can see on the bottom the anal fin there of this Goliath. There's a little clip taken out. That was for the fin clip to get the genetic material. There may be some spaghetti tags in there. I can't quite tell. Then we'd hold them in the water, kind of let them make sure everything was okay. That they weren't suffering any trauma and they were all healthy and happy. And then as soon as that seemed to be the case, we'd let them go and they'd swim off, typically right back to where we caught them from. Next slide. So this is our status. We went out and did through 2017, 2018, and tagged 30 different Goliath Grouper at 8 different sites, 11 of them being in the St. Lucie River, and then the rest being along the ICW and the Indian River Lagoon there, with one being tagged right at the inlet. There's a spot there where you can see a bunch of them, but it's a little hard to tag, we found out, despite our best efforts. And like I said earlier, we didn't have a lot of success catching them in natural habitats, which is something we were really trying to do because that would be a cool comparison, natural habitat versus artificial structure. However, we just weren't able to make it work, and so it ended up that all of the Goliath Grouper that we were able to catch that were the right size for tagging were caught on man-made structure. A lot of times, this was docks, bridges, pilings, things of that nature. Averaged about 28 inches in length for the ones that we tagged, anywhere from 20 to 45 being our largest one. This ends up being a couple years old. Typically, they make that shift offshore around 3 to 6 years of age. So a lot of the ones we were tagging were probably in that 1 to 3 age range. And then averaging about 17 pounds, but being over 30 of the largest one we caught. We're not actually sure how big it was because our scale only went up to 30 pounds and it bottomed that out. But there was one pretty big Goliath for inshore that we were able to tag before it headed offshore. This needs to be updated a bit, but I'm not 100% positive how many fin clips they're at, but it's definitely over 150 at this point. And these are going to be a little bit smaller in size because those ones that are too small to tag, we can still take a fin clip before releasing them. And so these are averaging about 1.5 feet, getting down to about 6 inches. So even the really small ones, we can take a tiny piece of their fin there and get some genetic material for the lab to analyze. Next slide. So what can we do with this data? What are we seeing? What can we kind of gather from putting these tags in these fish and looking at their movement? Unlike GPS, we don't get a point. This fish was here, then he was here, then he was here, he was here. You won't get constant updates. You only get information when they go by a receiver. And so I'll try and kind of orient you to these figures here. There are 4 different figures. Each one represents one Goliath Grouper. On the left-hand side of the y-axis there, you've got how far they are from the inlet. So the very bottom, that 0, the bottom of the graph would be at the inlet. And then the further upriver they are, the higher up on this graph that blue line representing the position of the Goliath grouper would be. And so if you would hit next thing there, Nicole. So then we can start to look at similar movements. So if you look at these kind of green shadowed areas, you see at this about same time, all of these Goliath grouper moved downriver. Go again, Nicole. We have another time where 2 of the 4 moved, but the other 2 didn't. And one more time. And then this portion here where 3 of them moved back upriver. And so you're seeing kind of some synchronous movement. However, it's not complete. Not all of them are doing this together. And so we can start to look at factors like why are they moving? Start to ask these questions. Is something causing them to move? Is it temperature, salinity, season? Is it what is going on here from the data that we can try and associate with this movement? Next slide. And so this is just one individual fish, so it's a little more clear. But we've got that same graph as before. Left-hand side is that distance to the inlet, and you can see the blue is the movement downward would be towards the inlet, and up would be upriver. And so if we look at this, we overlay it with, next slide there, Nicole. We can overlay it with temperature. So green line here is just temperature over that same date range. And we're looking at it and trying to see if there's anything that kind of matches up with this movement we're seeing. And temperature, maybe a little bit, but not anything real distinct. However, next slide. If you look at salinity, we do start to see some things lining up here, which is pretty neat. And so you'll see that orange line there on the left side, right around the beginning of July. You see a sharp drop in salinity. This was probably from a storm, a lot of water, rain flushing out the river there, making the salinity go from 6 to 10 parts per thousand all the way down to 0. And when that happened, the exact same time that Goliath grouper moved closer to the inlet to maybe saltier water, or at least something that's going to be a little bit less fresh for it than where it was. And then as the salinity in what looks like December or so starts to bounce back up, the fish moves back upriver. So maybe following this temperature gradient potentially. And then again, that happens the next year, same time. You get a big influx of fresh water that causes the salinity to drop. And again, the Goliath grouper moves downriver. So we can kind of look at different water quality parameters and see maybe what's triggering these fish, or what is at least correlating with their movement, which is really neat. Next slide. Oh, sorry, you'll have to push it a couple times. I forgot I had these little bars in here. So that's the areas I was talking about. All right, so we've got some in the river, some in the intercoastal, and we're all just kind of sitting there waiting for some to make this transition offshore. We've got, like I said, these 7-year tags. So by the end of the tag's life, when the batteries in the tag dies, all of them should move offshore. But we have such a range of sizes and ages that it should hopefully be spread out. And so we have seen a couple move offshore over the past few years, which is awesome. I think we have an animation here, Nicole, if you want to see if it works. All right, so the first one was actually our largest Goliath grouper. We tagged at 45 inches almost on Stewart Causeway. And we tagged it in May of 2017. And that following winter, it left going out the inlet and arriving at Greg Norman Wreck in January. I think it did this whole movement in about 2 days. It moved around, I think it's around 15 or 20 miles. So it's really neat, and that was our first one, and that it happened to, move to a space that we have a receiver is really awesome. One of the issues we have is, offshore is a very large area, and these receivers only have a limited range, so you're really trying to essentially guess where you think they might be headed. And so in our case, it's a lot of places where fish like to aggregate, things like reef lines and wrecks. And so you're trying to kind of put them out where you think they will hopefully go, and then cross your fingers that they go by there. Whereas if you have something like the river, where it's an enclosed area, you could put receivers all the way up and down the river and get, you could know where that fish was at any given point. And so there are some limitations to acoustic telemetry, especially when you get into very big systems like the open ocean. And so that was our largest one, moved out in the winter time. That's just a picture of it on the bottom right. You can just kind of see roughly how big it was. About what was it, almost 4 feet, 3.5 feet. Next slide. And then the following year, we had another Goliath grouper from Jensen Beach Causeway actually move offshore, tagged the same time as the first one, but didn't move offshore until the following year. And so that one was a little smaller. So we are seeing kind of the larger ones start to go off first, and then the next largest batch maybe. And same thing in the wintertime, this one kind of left where it was sitting for a long time and moved offshore. So it's acoustic telemetry for Goliath groupers is, for the most part, really boring. A lot of times they just sit in one spot for sometimes years. And you don't know if the fish is dead there, or maybe the transmitter fell out somehow or what. But then you have a kind of magic moment where finally you see, oh, the Goliath grouper all of a sudden, over the course of maybe 2 days or so, moves offshore. And that's kind of what you're just sitting and waiting to see. So it's really neat when it finally works out. And this one actually headed north instead of south. And so hopefully over time we'll get some better information as more move offshore and we see a little bit more movement up and down the coast from these adults that are off there. Maybe what's going on, if they're all just going wherever they feel like, if they're following currents, if they're following temperature gradients, things like that. Next slide. And so some really neat information when we go back and look at these detections. This is a similar figure as before. Blue line is the position of the grouper. Y-axis is the inlet or distance from the inlet. In this case, we have them going out the inlet. So you actually have positive distance being upriver and negative distance below that zero line being offshore. So when they cross that zero axis there, that's when they're actually going out the inlet. And we looked at salinity here, but salinity in the intercoastal doesn't fluctuate nearly as much as it does in the river. And so we didn't really see any correlation. But when we look at temperature, you can see that orange line. Like I said, this was in the winter when this happened. And so you see the temperature starts to drop, and finally it drops down to around 15 degrees Celsius. And as soon as it makes that big drop to the lowest temperature, all of a sudden that Goliath grouper takes off. And so you see with the other grouper that went off too, you see, at first you get a couple big drops and he moves a little bit closer to the inlet. And then finally when you have that big drop down to, I think it's 17 degrees Celsius, you're seeing him finally move offshore. And so it could be that this temperature is actually triggering and letting these bigger Goliath grouper know, like, now is the good time to make that transition. So pretty neat stuff. I do have to add that it's not forcing them to move. There were a bunch of fish tagged in these same spots, a bunch of Goliaths, and only one each year moved off while the others stayed there. So it's not that they're being forced to from, whether it's salinity or temperature or anything like that. It's maybe more of a cue rather than something that's actually making them they have to get away from. Next slide. This is some new data. I didn't have the time to make a nice figure for that because I just got it yesterday. But our third Goliath grouper has moved offshore. I just talked with the folks at Tequesta, and they just downloaded recently some of these receivers. Like a lot of folks, especially in the research game, that we've been having trouble with coronavirus, being able to get out and do our research for a while. But they have been able to go out and do some downloads recently, and we had a third Goliath grouper from the same area move offshore again. And it just so happens in that green circle is when he moved off. And this is a graph of temperature here. And you see, again, as he makes that move, right when the temperature drops down to kind of its lowest point, this time around 16 degrees Celsius. So we're seeing maybe 15 to 17 degrees Celsius being maybe the trigger that cues when the Goliath is big enough to make that transition offshore. Next slide. And so you see this map here of Florida. The kind of orange rectangle is where our study is kind of focused. And we also have that sister study I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that's going on the West Coast and kind of the 10,000 Islands area. And they are doing very similar study tagging juvenile Goliath grouper. However, the topography there and the setup is very different. It's a much more gradual shift from land to offshore, whereas we have more of a drop off where the land abruptly ends and all of a sudden you have the ocean, and that drops off pretty quickly as well into deeper water. So you're very different setup. However, they just told me yesterday that they actually had their first Goliath grouper move offshore as well, and that it also coincided with a drop in temperature this past winter. So some really cool stuff we're starting to see for both coasts. Whereas these younger Goliaths tagged in the river, are seeming to move a lot more based on the salinity and freshwater influx that they're getting. And it's a lot more frequent movement, a lot of smaller movements based on that fluctuating maybe salinity that they're seeming to correlate with. As they get older, they move into the intercoastal. They're a little bigger. They need some deeper water, and they get that more stable salinity. They get a lot maybe better habitat for larger individuals, like these docks and bridges that are found more frequently in the intercoastal. And they kind of sit there for a couple years potentially, waiting and waiting. And then when that temperature drops in winter, that's a cue, if they're old enough, to make that transition offshore. So some really neat stuff we're starting to see. This is a long study, so we're just getting into it's been a few years now, but we're still just getting into seeing some of the results from it. And so it's really neat, and hopefully we'll have a lot more coming up in future years to tell. Next slide. And so these tags still have 4 to 5 more years of life, so we'll hopefully get the rest of the juveniles making that transition offshore. And then we should, as they move offshore, the tags are still good. We still have receivers offshore. We may get some cool spawning aggregation movement, or seeing whether these Goliath groupers are going and staying in one spot their whole lives, or whether they're moving up the coast. Maybe they're going around the point onto the west coast. How much movement is actually going on in their adult lives, and whether they're maybe returning to the same spot every time to spawn. Do all of them do the same thing? There's a lot of questions still to be answered that we're looking forward to getting some of this more years of detections from these tags. We also have our genetics sampling is ongoing, so we're still taking fin clips. Like I said, it takes a lot of samples to get a good picture of what's going on with some of these new cool analyses that geneticists can do. I don't really quite understand how they do it, but they can get some really cool information from individual samples of DNA if they have enough samples. And then hopefully we'll get a better picture in the future too of how this, river or more like kind of inshore freshwater influenced area versus the intercoastal, the similarities and differences, and East Coast versus West Coast of Florida as well. Along with these, we're going to also be looking at things that are kind of major events that occur sometimes randomly, sometimes periodically, like hurricanes, red tide, and seeing how, if any, impact they are having on these Goliath grouper and their movements and transitions to adulthood. And I think that might be the last slide. Yep, and with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, thanks, Derek. All right, questions will be coming in here. And one question that we had was, so I know that looking at that map, we were looking at that Palm Beach area, and we know that when I talked about in the beginning of this presentation about the aggregation, so I've heard that they do the aggregation within the Palm Beach area, but is it also on the West Coast that they're doing the aggregation and spawning?
Yeah, so it happens on the West Coast as well. It's just harder to capture because on the West Coast you have to go so much further offshore. And so they do have, and there's studies by folks up at FSU, Chris Koenig and them, that have tagged adults with acoustic tags to monitor that spawning aggregation movement. So there's a cool paper they put out, and probably more papers to come on some of that. A previous acoustic tagging study that was really focused on the West Coast and the 10,000 Islands area, kind of Goliath grouper, but did have some in our area as well. And so theirs were just adults and just looking at the spawning aggregation movement, but did find out some cool stuff. And there's even in the Panhandle spawning aggregation that we don't know a whole lot about, but that showed up in some of these previous acoustic studies. So a lot of neat information that unfortunately takes a long time to really gather before you can present it. So it's kind of an investment in future knowledge when you start one of these studies, that you may not get any answers. Well, you may not get any ever if the transmitters don't transmit anything, or they don't go near the receivers like you hope they do. Best case scenario, after 5 to 7 years, you get some of the information that you were hoping to get.
Okay, and then let's see, we've got a question coming in. If we're diving in the next coming days or weeks off Palm Beach County, what can we expect to see for the spawning is, I can tell you right now, the numbers are quite low. Normally, we already have a good 20 to 30 on some of these wrecks. I think the Jupiter wreck has a little bit more action right now. The Palm Beach, like the South Palm Beach area, they're a little bit lower numbers. Do you think anything causing that low number?
And just to add to that too, spawning aggregations are probably the coolest time to see Goliath Grouper, but if you're willing to dive in a little murkier water, head north a little bit. A lot of the wrecks off kind of the Stewart area, St. Lucie Inlet, the viz is not as good, but there are Goliath Grouper there year round, almost guaranteed on a lot of those wrecks. There are a lot of times we go down and we'd see 6 or 12, in the same spot. So it's not just aggregation is the best time to see them, but that's not the only time you can see them by any means. And you don't have to necessarily get lucky to find one if you're going on some of these areas that may not be as pretty dives, but a lot more artificial wrecks and kind of more Goliath-y areas year round, potentially a little bit further north.
Okay, and some people are asking about like the moon phases and Goliaths. Can you explain a little bit what happens there?
Yeah, so that was, I think it's the same study that was done by Chris Koenig and FSU group when they did this acoustic tagging, looking at spawning aggregations. They looked at moon phase as well, and it seemed like the spawning was taking place with the moon phase. I want to say it was the full moon, but it might have been new moon. I'm not positive which one it was, but it seemed to correlate to the moon phase. So if you're, planning a dive and you're trying to get maybe best bang for your buck, it might be good to plan it around that moon phase. But it's by no means the only way to see them. They're out there, pretty much all around this time, but maybe just getting the greatest number close to that. I want to say it's the full moon, but I can't honestly remember exactly what the paper said. But it's data like that we're able to get from these studies, and so it's cool stuff that they're seeing. And I think they were even able to watch them spawn or to collect eggs and verify that was Goliath Grouper eggs in that study. So it was really cool stuff that they were finding.
And then talking about lunar cycles, they're asking about, you guys have a lot of juvenile. Does that have any effect on the migration patterns for them?
Can you say it again? They're asking about what?
They're asking about the lunar cycles with the juveniles. Are those juvenile movement patterns, migration patterns, anything to do with the lunar cycle?
So not that we've seen so far. As we get more data, we'll be able to say better, because as with a lot of these studies, they don't always do the same thing. You may have 20 Goliath Grouper and 5 of them do one thing, 10 of them doing something else. And so these first couple are interesting, but it may end up being something else at the end of this when we have all the data. Preliminarily, we didn't see anything with lunar cycle, but that's not to say that it wasn't a factor. Once we have a little bit more data and higher numbers for this transition, we may turn out that it was something that they're using to cue and to make that transition.
They're also asking if do the groupers respond to bait fish migrations?
That's a good question, and something that I don't know if anyone's looked into. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by big fish migrations.
There's they ask the mullets, they migrate. So are they going after? I think majority of the Goliath Grouper's diet is more like worms and snails, right?
Yeah, so actually the group at FSU, they've probably done the most research on Goliath Grouper to date. And so they did a diet study, and a big portion was kind of bait fish and little crabs and things like that. So not what you would kind of picture this big fish, eating. And so a lot of smaller fish and crustaceans. So I don't know of any correlation with some of these big fish migrations, but it may turn out, because we have this network of researchers working together, we may be able to see that our fish are moving at the same time that some of these other tagged fish are, or it may line up with something that's just a kind of like the mullet run, a known migration. And unfortunately, kind of just a wait and see kind of thing.
Okay. Sorry, there's one that's in the same question here. Okay, so then they want to know how far they might like aggregate during this time. Do they?
Like how far one might move to go to a spawning aggregation?
Yeah, so they're coming to West Palm, but I mean, do they have any tagged individuals that have come from like the Carolinas or down from the Keys?
So I'd have to refresh myself with that Koenig study that did the tagging of the adults. I think most of them came from within 30 to 60 miles of where they spawned, but there may have been one or two individuals that, I think there was one individual in particular in that study that went hundreds of miles to spawn. And so while that's not the normal thing, it seems like most of them are kind of already in the area they're going to spawn. It is possible. Not all fish behave like they're supposed to or like others do. And so you may have, one individual or two that are making these big movements while others are kind of staying in one spot. You may have some that are spawning at the same place over and over, and others that spawn here and then they move up a little bit and they spawn here. So it's really variable. And studies like we did with snook may show that it's not that everyone's doing the same thing. And maybe some years they don't spawn at all. It's probably going to be a combination of things that they're doing, but there are some that are moving long distances, it seems like.
So that goes into a question someone's asking about, like the DNA variety. Like, are you seeing that there's certain individuals that are like the alpha mating males that are getting the majority of the DNA that's coming from them, or is that
so? Unfortunately,
study?
We don't have any results yet. Right now, we're just in the collections phase of genetics, and so I think they need 500 to 1,000 or something samples to really say much of anything with it. And so I think we're just waiting until we reach a number that would be significant for them to run. So I think it's a pretty quick thing once they have it all to run these tests and analyses to figure it out, but they haven't done that yet. We're waiting for more samples. But once we get that, hopefully it should be some pretty cool information, and it may tell us, maybe these few fish are responsible for the majority of what we see, or it could be there's, because you have a population that was so low rebounding, it could be there's a lot of kind of inbreeding going on that can cause some issues with genetic diversity. Low genetic diversity a lot of times can lead to things like being, more susceptible to viruses or to maybe infections or things like that. That a higher genetic diversity can help alleviate that pressure and that mortality. So kind of we'll find out hopefully soon once we get enough samples for it.
Yeah, and to follow up, the same person was saying, like, maybe the individuals that survived that 70s and 80s period are the parents of all these newer fish that we're seeing.
Yeah, so I think I actually forgot to mention, but the age of Goliath Grouper, they can, live a long time. And so I think the oldest one on record is 37 years old, but we think they can live maybe 50 or longer years. And so another, gap in our knowledge, because we don't have a lot of samples where with that ear bone to tell how old they are, we don't really know what the range of ages is and whether most of them are teenagers or because we really are looking for those bigger, older females to spawn because they produce typically a lot more eggs, significantly larger number of eggs than the slightly smaller females. And so it could be that we've got kind of this new batch from when that moratorium on fishing in the 1990 was placed. Maybe those ones that were juveniles then are majorly responsible for a lot of the juveniles that we have now. And so some of that genetics can potentially tell us answers to that, hopefully.
And so that's actually a question because there's been some researchers that have come out with papers saying that you can actually tell a difference between a female and a male Goliath grouper, especially during a spawning event, because like the colors change on them. What's your guys' stance on being able to sex out an animal?
Yeah, so the only for sure way at this point is to unfortunately cut them open and look at their reproductive system. But it does seem like from photography. Yeah, did you lose me there? So to repeat that, it does seem like.
Yeah, so just repeat what you just said.
Okay, yeah. So The only for sure way that we have right now is to actually cut the fish open and look at their reproductive system to see whether they're male or female, unfortunately, which means we have very little information about that because people aren't going and catching and killing these. But it does seem like from video and from photos and stuff that they are changing their coloration depending on their mating behavior. So females maybe, I can't remember if it's females are getting lighter when they're about to spawn or the other way around, but it does seem like that is a thing where they are changing their coloration depending on male, female, and the portion of the spawning behavior that they're going through. So it's pretty neat. I don't recall exactly which is which, but it may be that that's the case, which is cool. And a lot of fish do that and can change color for a variety of reasons, but spawning and mating being one of them.
Awesome. So when we're diving with these groupers, if you get into their space, we've noticed that they make these barking noises. What is that signal telling us, and how is that being created?
So it could mean a number of things. Lots of fish have that kind of grunting ability where they can produce that kind of vibration. Goliath grouper, it's especially loud, and you can feel it when you're underwater with them. So that could be alerting other Goliath to your presence. It could be telling you, even though we don't necessarily get it, to back off. I don't really know for sure if it means a single thing or if it's just has multiple meanings. Maybe it's more like a dog barking, where different grunts or noises they make have different meanings that we just can't distinguish necessarily. But that's something that would be really cool to get into. I think someone has done some acoustic study on a different acoustic study actually on the sounds they're making acoustics. But I don't know that it looked into that. I think it looked more at like presence. It could identify this is a Goliath grouper, and so they could leave a hydrophone out and say, we heard Goliath grouper making their grunts here. But I don't know that it looked at if there's different types of grunts and what they could maybe mean. But that would definitely be something cool, especially as divers, to look at more. So
talking about divers, the diving community here in South Florida, we love to be able to get involved and help, collect citizen science for you guys. So is there any kind of projects that are looking for things like photographs and videos, and what are they looking for, and who can we reach out to?
Yeah, so there's the reef surveys that Reef does, where it's just a fish count. Essentially, you go out and you go on their website. I think you get certified to show that you can ID fish, and then you go out and you write down which fish you see out there, and that goes into this giant database that is all citizen science information about what fish are where. And actually, one of the figures I showed in the presentation was data from that program, where we're using divers to say, hey, there's this many Goliath this time I went out, and there's this many, and you have enough divers doing that, and you can get actually a pretty good picture of where the Goliath grouper are and their relative abundance, and even things like changes year to year. And so they can definitely help with that. I know photos help. I'm blanking on her name right now, but someone was doing a photo project where the spots on their face, similar to a dolphin or something that has very distinct markings, they can actually match those up and re-identify individuals over time based on a picture on their face. I'd have to double check if that project is still ongoing, but I know at one point they were using photos and kind of facial recognition software to say, this picture of a Goliath is the exact same as this one, so they're the same individual, seen in these two different places, or maybe seen in this one spot 10 years apart, or whatever it may be. But similar to whales and manatees that have unique markings on each individual, like a fingerprint, they actually can match up Goliath grouper just based on photos of their face. I'd have to double check to see if that's still going on or not, though. I know it was. They were taking photos from divers to help get a big database going at one point.
And so what is the future for the Goliath groupers and with FWC? I know that once in a while we get them out on the table of conversation, and us divers, we get rallied up and we wear our shirts that say save the Goliaths, and we go and we rally, and they usually stay protected. So is there any potential meetings that are coming up that we need to be aware of,
so
or
we
anything that we can
at
do?
The last commission meeting, actually, they brought up Goliath grouper kind of as a reminder. The commission said, hey, what's going on with Goliath Grouper? And this past few years has been kind of a research and data collection, trying to get a better understanding of this population. And we were instructed at this last commission meeting by the commissioners to come back in, I think, late next year to present kind of an updated research, what we found in the past few years with the different groups that are doing, studies on these fish. And so that's what we've got planned for the future, is kind of just a research update next year. And beyond that, it's hard to say, really.
Awesome. Well, hopefully, you can get the diving community to rally again, and we'll keep them on the protected list. We love diving with them. Like I said, guys, if you are interested in checking these big animals out during the month of August, starting in August and through October, that's usually when the big aggregation of spawning happens in the Palm Beach area. So we have our boats that are scheduled to go out, and they usually, every day, we've got boats going out diving. So if you want to get on one of those dives, give us a call at 4C, and we'll get you scheduled. We also have some group dives coming up. We have this Saturday, we have a group dive. 2 spots are open right now. So if you go on our website, you can sign up. And then also on September 13th, we have another one scheduled to do a group dive to go and see these guys. And that being said, we are giving away a Goliath Grouper boat trip. So let me pull up my screen. Derek, I'm going to put you small here for a second. Okay, guys, let's pull up this screen and let's get my random name picker. Okay, let's bring Derek back in. And this, here we go. Make this bigger. Okay, so you guys, if you registered on our Eventbrite for tonight's presentation, I pulled your names and put them in the random name picker. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hide you again there, Derek, so I can see it a little bit more. Okay, random name picker. Here we go, guys. I'm going to click on this green button, and it's going to generate a name for me. Here we go. Ta-da! And our winner is Daniel Ranero. Daniel, if you are watching right now, give us a thumbs up. That's your, we're excited to win a dive to go see the Goliath Groupers. So we're going to be contacting you via email to tell you how to get in and see those groupers on a dive this season. So Daniel Ranero, you are our winner for tonight. Excellent. So looking forward to and you guys, thank you all for watching tonight. We definitely appreciate the support. And as divers, you need to support FWC. There's plenty of different ways. It's not just about the law enforcement, like he said. There is research and conservation going on behind the scenes. So anytime you purchase a saltwater license, or if you purchase your tags for your car, you can make donations to help with any of these research projects. That just helps FWC guys do their job so that they can continue to protect our wildlife and making it, abundant so that we can see it when we go diving. So, Derek, thank you so much for a great presentation. Everybody's, giving you a thumbs up right now and telling you thank you. So we appreciate your time, and especially you got a new little baby girl. So congratulations to you and Lauren. We are very excited. Lauren is one of our instructors. And we're very excited that you guys have a new little baby to be able to go and dive with. Yeah. So
someday.
All righty. Well, thanks, Derek, and everybody. Thank you so much, and stay tuned. Next month is Shark Month. That's right, our 4C Shark Month. So we're going to have some great Facebook Live presentations coming at you. So stay tuned. All right. Have a great night. Bye.